The dust of the high desert rose in a furious churning cloud, a tan specter chasing the conquered stagecoach as it rattled down the canyon pass. Inside, the passengers bounced like dried beans in a jar. Outside, Reed Maddox rode parallel on his gelding, keeping a respectful distance. He was just a rancher heading into dusty redemption for supplies, a man whose world had shrunk to the boundaries of his fence line and the perimeter of his grief. He preferred the quiet company of the wind to the chatter of men. But the stage offered a measure of safety from the less savory travelers who haunted these parts. Safety, it turned out, was a fleeting notion. The crack of a rifle shot echoed off the canyon walls, sharp and definitive. The lead horse screamed and stumbled, its cry a terrible harmony with the splintering of wood as the driver's box took a hit. The coach lurched, wheels skidding in the dirt, and ground to a halt in a cacophony of panicked whinnies and human shouts. From the rocks above, 3 riders descended, bandanas pulled high over their faces, rifles leveled. Everybody out, one of them barked, his voice muffled, but his intent clear as day. Nice and easy, and nobody gets ventilated. Reed reacted without thought. Years of solitude hadn't dulled the instincts honed by a harder, younger life. He spurred his horse not toward the bandits, but away, using the bulk of the stagecoach as cover. He dismounted in a single fluid motion, pulling the Winchester from its scabbard. He was no lawman, no hero looking for a fight. He was a man in the wrong place at the wrong time, and survival was a language he spoke fluently. The passengers were spilling out now, a whiskey drummer with sweat-stained collar, a woman in a faded calico dress clutching her purse, a young couple holding hands so tightly their knuckles were white. Reed hunkered down behind a rear wheel, the iron rim cool against his cheek. He sighted down the long barrel of his rifle, the world narrowing to the space between the front sight and the chest of the bandit nearest the driver. He didn't want to kill anyone. Killing left ghosts, and he had more than his share already. He aimed for the man's shoulder, a shot to disable, not to end. He squeezed the trigger. The Winchester bucked against him, and the bandit cried out, dropping his rifle as he spun and fell. Chaos erupted. The other 2 bandits opened fire, their shots thudding into the side of the coach, kicking up plumes of red dust. Reed worked the lever on his rifle, chambering another round. He fired again, this time at the dirt near the second bandit's feet. The man yelped and scrambled back toward the rocks, seeking better cover. The third bandit, the leader, was smarter. He grabbed the woman in the calico dress, pulling her in front of him as a shield. "You want to play hero rancher?" He snarled, his eyes wild above the bandana. "She pays the price." Reed froze. His finger hovered over the trigger, useless. The woman sobbed, her body trembling. He could see the terror in her eyes, a mirror of a helplessness he knew all too well. For a moment he wasn't in the canyon. He was somewhere else, somewhere dark and cold. The air thick with dust and the scent of crushed rock. The sound of splintering timber echoing in his memory. The standoff stretched time, thinning to a wire. The bandit began to back away, dragging the woman with him. He was going to get away. Reed's mind raced, searching for an angle, a distraction, anything. It was the whiskey drummer who provided it. With a desperate liquor-fueled roar, he threw his sample case. It spun end over end, striking the bandit's horse on the flank. The animal shied violently, pulling the reins from the bandit's hand. For a single critical second, the man's attention was divided. His grip on the woman loosened. It was all Reed needed. He didn't aim for the man. He aimed for the rock just beside his head. The bullet struck with a percussive crack, spraying stone chips into the bandit's face. He roared in pain and surprise, staggering back, releasing the woman, who scrambled away on hands and knees. Reed was on his feet and moving, closing the distance. The bandit fumbled for his pistol, but Reed was faster. The butt of the Winchester came down hard on the man's wrist, and the gun clattered to the ground. Another swift movement, and Reed had the man pin, the rifle barrel pressed against his throat. The fight was over. The second bandit had already fled into the rocks, and the first was moaning on the ground, clutching his bleeding shoulder. As the passengers rushed to help the shaken woman, Reed kept his eyes on the man beneath him. "It's done," he said, his voice low and gravelly. The bandit, his face now bare and streaked with grime, spat a string of curses. As Reed disarmed him, something fell from the man's vest pocket, landing in the dust with a soft clink. It was a silver locket, tarnished and dented, but intricately made. Reed picked it up without thinking, his thumb brushing away the dirt, and his world stopped. Engraved on the surface was a small, delicate bird, with its wings outstretched in mid-flight. A lark. The air left his lungs in a ragged gasp. He knew this engraving. He had traced its lines 1,000 times with his fingertip. It was the same design, identical down to the last feathered detail, as the locket he had given his wife Alara on their first anniversary. The locket she had been wearing the day the Silver Creek mine collapsed. The day he had lost everything. He stared at the piece of silver, the canyon around him, fading into a dull, meaningless hum. The metal felt impossibly cold in his palm, a piece of ice from a frozen past. He looked up at the bandit, his eyes no longer those of a reluctant protector, but of a man staring into the face of a ghost. Where Reed's voice was a raw whisper, tight with a pain he thought he had buried deep. "Oh, did you get this?" The bandit just sneered, blood trickling from his lip. "Go to hell, rancher." But Reed wasn't there anymore. He was back in the darkness, the weight of the mountain pressing down, the frantic shouts of men swallowed by the roar of falling rock. He could hear Alara's brother Thomas yelling his name, and then a final terrible silence. He could see her face smiling at him that morning, the lark locket gleaming at her throat. A promise. A memory. And now a mystery held in the grimy hand of a common thief. The robbery was over, but for Reed Maddox, a far more dangerous confrontation had just begun. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He was a man with a question, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the answer would drag him back into the very darkness he had spent 5 years trying to escape. Reed's ranch was a testament to the stubbornness of life in a land that offered little charity. The cabin was built of solid pine, weathered to a silver gray that matched the winter sky. The corrals were sturdy, the barn swept clean, the fences meticulously mended. It was a place of order, a fortress of routine built against the chaos of memory. For 5 years since the mine collapse, this patch of unforgiving earth had been Reed's entire world. He worked from before dawn until long after dusk, seeking the bone-deep weariness that might grant him a few hours of dreamless sleep. His days were governed by the needs of his small herd of cattle and the turning of the seasons. He spoke more to his horse Bramble than to any human. The silence of the ranch wasn't empty. It was filled with the ghosts of what might have been. The echo of laughter in the kitchen where Alara had baked bread, and the imagined scuff of a child's boots on the porch, the phantom weight of her head on his shoulder as they watched the sunset paint the mesas in hues of fire and gold. Grief was a quiet tenant in his home, demanding little but occupying every room. He kept a single photograph on the mantelpiece, a faded tintype of him and Alara on their wedding day. She was beautiful, her dark hair pinned up her eyes bright, with a hope that now felt like a cruel joke. He looked so much younger, a man who believed the future was a straight and open road. He rarely looked at the photo, but he could never bring himself to put it away. It was a reminder of the man he used to be, before his world was reduced to dust and echoes. The locket from the robbery now sat beside that photograph, a stark and unwelcome intruder. He had turned the bandits over to the sheriff in redemption, but his questions about the locket had yielded nothing but sullen silence. The thief claimed he'd won it in a card game in a town Reed had never heard of. It was a lie. Reed knew it in his gut, but it was a dead end. Now the piece of silver sat on his mantel, a question mark forged in metal. It wasn't Alara's. Hers was buried with her, sealed in the earth under tons of rock. But this one was identical. A twin. Had the jeweler made two? Or was it something else, a thread connected to that day he couldn't see? The thought was a splinter in his mind, nagging and persistent. His nights were the worst. That was when the memories clawed their way out of the darkness he kept them in. He would dream of the mine, of the rumble that started deep in the earth, the groaning of the timber supports like the death cries of ancient trees. He'd see the panic in the miners' eyes, the flickering of their lamps creating a frantic dance of shadows. He would hear the voice of Alara's younger brother Thomas, yelling at him to run, and then the final deafening roar as the world came down. He always woke up then drenched in sweat, his own silent scream trapped in his throat, the guilt as fresh and raw as it was on that first day. It was during one such restless dawn that he first saw the girl. He had risen before the sun, seeking solace in the familiar ritual of mending a broken harness. He was heading to the well near his eastern fence line when he saw her. She was on the neighboring property, a desolate, scrubby piece of land owned by the widow, Clara Stanton, a woman known for her sour disposition and sharp tongue. The girl, who couldn't have been more than 12, was small for her age, a bundle of sharp angles and hunched shoulders, her dress a thing of rags and patches. Fear was a language she knew better than scripture, a silent dialect learned at the end of Clara's switch. Emma hauled a heavy wooden bucket from the well, her thin arms trembling with the strain. As she turned, she stumbled, and a wave of water sloshed over the rim, darkening the dust at her bare feet. The slap echoed across the still morning air like a rifle shot. Clara Stanton appeared from the house, a towering figure in black, her face a mask of pinched fury. Clumsy little wretch, she spat, her voice carrying on the wind. She raised a thin, wicked-looking cane. Emma flinched but made no sound, a lesson learned through brutal repetition. Tears only made the beatings last longer. Reed stood frozen on his side of the fence, his hands clenching into fists. He had heard rumors about the widow and the orphan girl she'd taken in, whispers of cruelty that the townsfolk chose to ignore. It was easier to look away. But seeing it, hearing that sharp crack of cane on bone, watching the girl bow her head in silent practiced submission, that was different. It stirred something in him, an old buried instinct to protect the helpless. He watched for the next 2 days. Each morning the girl was at the well, her movements small and careful, as if the very earth might betray her. He saw the fresh bruises on her arms and the split in her lip. On the third day he couldn't stand it any longer. He left a small bundle on a fence post for her, a loaf of bread still warm from his oven. He watched from the trees as she crept forward, her eyes darting toward the house, and unwrapped it. She fell to her knees and ate it with a desperation that twisted something in his gut the next time he spoke to her. "You all right?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. She jumped, her eyes wide with panic, and wouldn't answer. He didn't press. He just left a steaming tin cup on the post. "Tea," he said. "Chamomile." He knew he was crossing a line. This was not his business. He had built his life on the principle of keeping to himself. But the image of her bruised face was now intertwined with the ghosts of his past. Alara had always been the one to stand for others. She would have never stayed silent. In helping this girl, he felt a flicker of the man he had been when she was alive, a man who believed some things were worth fighting for. The thought was both a comfort and a terror. The final confrontation happened on a morning when the sun rose, cruel and fast, blistering the already parched ground. Reed was checking the fence line when he saw Clara drag Emma from the house by her hair. The girl's quiet whimper was the spark that lit the fuse. He swung himself over the fence before he could think twice. His boots hit the dust of Clara Stanton's property with a thud that felt like a declaration of war. "Let her go," he said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the air with the weight of granite. Clara spun around her face, contorting with rage. This is my land. She is my charge. You have no right. Right has nothing to do with it. Reed set his eyes fixed on the welts visible on Emma's neck. He saw the terror in the girl's eyes, the same terror he'd seen on the face of the woman held hostage by the bandit, the same terror he imagined on Alara's face in her final moments. It was a look that demanded action. I saw the bruises, he said, his voice dropping lower. I've seen them for days. You touch this child again, I'll ride to the sheriff before the sun is high. Clara laughed a harsh grating sound. She's my property. The town gave her to me. She's a child. Reed countered, taking a step closer. The air crackled with tension. Not a mule. You beat her again, and I swear to you I will bury you in legal trouble so deep you'll never see daylight. His words were a bluff. He knew little of the law, but they were delivered with the unshakable conviction of a man with nothing left to lose. Clara's sneer faltered. For the first time she saw something in his eyes that went beyond a neighborly dispute. She saw a line had been drawn. He looked past her directly at Emma, who was staring at him, her small face a canvas of disbelief and dawning hope. He spoke 4 words that would change everything. You're coming with me. He held out his hand. Emma hesitated for a heartbeat, her gaze flickering from Reed's steady expression to Clara's sputtering fury. Then, with a courage that seemed to rise from the very soles of her feet, she took a step. And another. She walked past Clara without looking at her and stopped beside Reed. She didn't take his hand, but her presence at his side was an answer louder than any word. Reed scooped her up his movements, sure and steady, and placed her on Bramble's saddle before swinging up behind her. He didn't look back as they rode away, the dust from his horse's hooves settling over the silent, defeated figure of Clara Stanton. As they cleared the rise and the widow's wretched house disappeared from view, Emma finally allowed a single silent tear to trace a path through the grime on her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was the first crack in a dam that had held back an ocean of pain for years. And as they rode toward the sanctuary of his quiet ranch, Reed knew he had just invited a new kind of ghost into his life. Not one of memory, but one of responsibility. The town of Redemption was slow to pass judgment, but quick to talk. News of Reed Maddox riding off with the Stanton girl spread faster than a prairie fire. By the time Clara Stanton, face powdered to hide her rage, arrived in town 2 days later, the story had already been twisted into a dozen different shapes. Some saw Reed as a savior, others as a kidnapper. Most just saw it as trouble they wanted no part of. Clara went straight to the sheriff's office. But Sheriff Mallory, a man whose weary posture was a monument to years of dealing with other people's messes, offered little immediate satisfaction. He claims you were beating her, Clara Mallory said, leaning back in his creaking chair. Lies, she hissed, dabbing at her dry eyes with a handkerchief. She's a difficult, ungrateful child. He's a lonely, unstable man who took what wasn't his. The law, however, was a slow and cumbersome beast. Without clear proof of ownership or abuse, Mallory could only file a report and promise to look into it. Clara, however, was not a woman to wait on bureaucracy. She needed an ally, someone with influence and a smoother tongue. She found him at the Redemption Saloon holding court at a corner table. Hank Cooper had arrived in town a month prior. A charming man with an easy smile, a quick wit, and pockets that seemed surprisingly deep for a newcomer. He claimed to be a land surveyor, but he spent more time playing cards and buying rounds than he did studying maps. The townsfolk were taken with him. He had a way of making people feel important, of listening with an intensity that bordered on predatory. Mr. Cooper, Clara said, approaching his table with a carefully crafted air of distress. I am in desperate need of a gentleman's advice. Hank looked up from his cards, his blue eyes assessing her in a single sweeping glance. He smiled, a slow curve of his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. Widow Stanton, he said, gesturing to the empty chair. I hear you've had some trouble. Please tell me all about it. By the time she finished her story sanded and polished to present her as a benevolent victim, Hank was nodding with grave sympathy. "A terrible injustice," he murmured. "This Maddox fellow. He sounds like a man who believes he is the law. That's a dangerous thing in these parts. He is," Clara insisted. "He threatened me. The man is unhinged. Then we shall simply have to use the real law to remind him of his place," Hank said smoothly. He patted her hand. "Don't you worry, Clara. I know a thing or two about legal matters. We will file a formal petition. We'll demand a hearing before the circuit judge. We will paint a picture of a distraught guardian and a rogue rancher. By the time we're done, this town will see Maddox for the brute he is." Clara felt a wave of relief so profound it almost made her dizzy. "You would do that for me?" "Of course," Hank said, his smile widening. "Let's just say I have a personal interest in seeing that men like Reed Maddox get what they deserve." He looked past her, his gaze distant and cold for just a moment before the charming mask slipped back into place. "Now let's go see about retaining a lawyer." Back at the ranch, life had settled into a fragile routine. Emma was a ghost in the cabin, at first flinching at every raised voice, every sudden movement. She ate with her head down, spoke only when spoken to, and cleaned with a frantic, obsessive energy, as if cleanliness were a shield against punishment. Reed gave her space. He set a cot for her in the corner of the main room, showed her where the blankets were, and simply said, "This is your place now. You're safe here." He learned her language was silence, so he spoke it with her. He didn't demand conversation. He worked alongside her, mending fences, feeding the chickens, showing her how to groom Bramble. He communicated through quiet actions, a plate of food left on the table, a new pair of sturdy boots placed by her cot, a patched-up dress folded on her pillow. Slowly, tentatively, she began to emerge from her shell. The first time she spoke without being prompted, it was to ask about the brand on his cattle. He explained the design, an M intertwined with a broken circle. "For Maddox," he said. "The circle, that's for things that don't have a proper end." He didn't elaborate, but she seemed to understand. Her nightmares were fierce. She would wake up gasping a silent scream caught in her throat. Reed never rushed to her side. He would simply get up, stoke the fire, and sit at the table until her ragged breathing evened out. He knew that comfort for her was not about touch, but about presence. A steady, unthreatening shadow in the dark. The first obstacle arrived a week later in the form of a deputy. He rode up to the cabin with a folded piece of paper. "Reed Maddox," he asked, not unkindly. "You've been served? Formal petition from Clara Stanton. Judge Carroll's coming through next month. He'll hear the case in Blackstone." Reed took the paper, his face grim. He read the legal jargon, the false accusations, the claims of his instability, and her deep familial bond to the child she had abused. And at the bottom, signed as a witness and supporter of the petition, was a name he didn't recognize, Hank Cooper. That night, he told Emma. She sat at the table, her small hands clenched in her lap, her face pale. "She'll take me back." She whispered the words filled with a certainty that broke his heart. "No," Reed said, his voice a low growl. "She won't." He looked at her, seeing not just a frightened child, but a reflection of his own failure to protect the people he cared about. He had failed Alara. He would not fail Emma. "I made you a promise. You are safe here. We will fight this. Together." Emma looked up, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. For the first time, she didn't look away from his gaze. She just nodded, a small, jerky movement. In that moment, they were no longer just a man and a girl thrown together by circumstance. They were a pact, a fortress of two against the coming storm. And as Reed looked at the legal papers signed by this stranger, Hank Cooper, he felt a cold premonition that the storm would be far worse than a simple custody battle. The weeks leading up to the hearing were a quiet war of nerves. From his few trips into redemption, Reed learned that Hank Cooper was methodically turning the town against him. Cooper was a master of whispers and insinuations. He never raised his voice, never made a direct accusation in public. Instead, he bought drinks at the saloon and spoke of his concern for the poor widow Stanton. He mentioned Reed's reclusive nature, hinting at a darkness bred from loneliness and tragedy. A man who loses his wife in such a terrible way. It can break something inside him, he'd say to the blacksmith, his voice full of false sympathy. Makes him unpredictable. To the women of the church sewing circle, he'd murmur, "Clara admits she was stern, but her heart is in the right place. She just wants to honor her cousin's memory by raising the girl right." This Maddox fellow, he tore that family apart. The threats began subtly. A freshly dug hole appeared in the middle of the path, leading from the ranch, too small for a grave, but unsettling in its implication. A week later, the rope for the well was cut during the night. They were acts of petty malice, impossible to prove, designed to unnerve them, to make them feel isolated and vulnerable. Reed repaired the damage without comment, but a new harder line settled around his jaw. He began teaching Emma to shoot. He started her with an old small-caliber pistol, showing her how to hold it, how to brace herself, how to breathe before squeezing the trigger. "I don't want you to ever have to use this," he said, his hands guiding hers. "But I don't want you to be afraid of it either. Fear makes other people powerful." She was a natural. Her hands were steady, her eyes sharp. The focus required for aiming seemed to calm the anxious energy that always hummed beneath her surface. In the evenings, while he cleaned his rifle, she would read. He'd bought her a stack of old dime novels and a book of poetry. Her voice, at first a hesitant whisper, as she sounded out the words, grew stronger and more confident with each passing night. She was building a world for herself, inside the cabin walls, a world made of stories and knowledge, a place Clara could never touch. Reed, meanwhile, was haunted by the locket on his mantel. The mystery of it gnawed at him. He knew the stagecoach robber's claim of winning it in a card game was a lie. There was a connection to his past. He felt it like a change in the wind. He rode to the next county over to the town where the jeweler who had made Alara's locket had his shop. The old man was still there, his eyes magnified by thick spectacles. "Yes, I remember the piece," the jeweler said, peering at Reed's sketch. "A silver lark. A special commission for a young man for his wife. That was, 5-6 years ago now. Did you ever make another one?" "An identical one?" Reed asked, his heart thumping. The jeweler shook his head slowly. "No, son. That was a one-of-a-kind mold. I broke it after the casting as requested. The young man was very specific. Said he wanted it to be unique, just like her." The information settled in Reed's gut like a cold stone. It wasn't a copy, which meant the locket the bandit had was the one from the mine. But how the mine was sealed, a tomb of rock and earth. No one had been inside since the collapse. The pieces didn't fit, and the missing one felt menacingly large. He started having the nightmares more frequently, but they were changing. Details he had long suppressed were surfacing. The scent of blasting powder in the air just before the collapse stronger than usual. A brief heated argument between the foreman and a new miner, whose face he couldn't quite recall. The memory was a murky pool, and he felt as though something dangerous was swimming just beneath the surface. One afternoon, as Emma practiced her aim on a line of tin cans, Hank Cooper paid them a visit. He rode up to the fence line, not with threats, but with that same disarming smile. Reed met him there, his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. Maddox, Cooper said with a friendly nod. "Just wanted to come out here myself, see how the girl was settling in. Clara's worried sick, you know." "She's fine," Reed said flatly. Cooper's eyes flickered to Emma, who had lowered her pistol but stood her ground, her expression unreadable. Then his gaze fell to Reed's belt, where Reed had taken to carrying the locket in a small leather pouch, an unconscious habit. "That's a unique design," Cooper said, his voice casual, but his eyes sharp with an intensity that made the hairs on Reed's neck stand up. A lark, isn't it, symbol of a new day? Of hope. Reed's blood ran cold. How could he know the design from a glance at a leather pouch? It's a family heirloom. Reed set his voice tight. Cooper's smile didn't waver, but something dark flickered in his eyes. Family is a powerful thing, isn't it? Maddox people will do anything to protect it, or to avenge it. He tipped his hat. I'll see you at the hearing. I do hope you'll reconsider. A girl belongs with her kin. He rode off, leaving Reed standing in a silence that was more terrifying than any threat. Avenge it. The word echoed in his mind. Cooper wasn't just a charming meddler. He had a purpose, and his casual mention of the lark was no accident. He knew about the locket. That night, Reed didn't sleep. He sat at the table, the locket in one hand, his rifle in the other, trying to piece together a puzzle whose edges were soaked in blood and memory. He thought of Alara's family. Her parents were long dead. She had 2 brothers, Thomas the younger, who had died beside her in the mine. And then there was the older one, Hank, a drifter, a gambler, a man with a wild streak, who had left town years before the wedding and never returned. Reed had only met him once, a brief, tense encounter. He tried to summon a face, but all he could remember were the eyes. Cold blue and full of a restless resentment. Hank Cooper. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He stood up so fast his chair scraped violently against the floor. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a reckoning. The charming stranger in town, the man turning everyone against him, was his brother-in-law, a man who had lost his only 2 siblings in a mine owned in part by Reed's family, a man who had every reason to hate him. The custody battle, the threats, Clara, it was all a stage, and he and Emma were the unwitting actors in a play written for revenge. The fight was no longer about saving a child. It was about surviving a ghost from his own grave. The knowledge changed everything. The random acts of malice now formed a coherent, terrifying pattern. Hank Cooper wasn't just trying to take Emma away. He was dismantling Reed's life piece by piece, isolating him, painting him as a monster. It was a slow psychological siege, and the custody hearing was just the opening salvo. Reed now understood that losing Emma in court was only the beginning of what Hank had planned for him. The goal wasn't to hurt him. It was to destroy him, to make him feel the same crushing helplessness Hank must have felt when he learned his family had been wiped out. A cold, grim resolve settled over Reed. He had been reacting, defending. Now he had to attack. Not with fists or bullets, but with the truth. He rode back to Blackstone, the mining town where he had once lived with Alara. It was a place he had avoided for 5 years, a town of ghosts and painful memories. But it also held the key. He went to the county records office, a dusty room filled with the scent of aging paper and stale ink. He spent hours poring over old employment logs from the Silver Creek mine. And there it was. Hired 3 weeks before the collapse, a miner named John Smith, a common enough alias. But the clerk remembered him. "Oh, the quiet one," the old man said, peering over his spectacles. "Kept to himself. Left town right after the collapse." Funny thing, though. The foreman said he was asking a lot of questions about the blasting protocols, about the shoring in the western tunnels. Seemed more interested in how the mine worked than in working it. The western tunnels. That's where the collapse had happened, where Alara and Thomas had been. Next, Reed visited the retired town doctor, a man who had treated his own share of mining injuries over the years. He asked about the Cooper family. Tragic, the doctor said, shaking his head. Losing 2 children at once like that, it destroyed their parents. They left town not long after. But the older boy, Hank, he was always a different sort. Wild, full of anger. He came back to town for a day after the funeral. I saw him near the mine entrance, just staring at it. The look in his eyes. It wasn't grief. It was something harder. Like he was making a promise to the mountain. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture of cold, premeditated revenge. Hank hadn't just stumbled upon an opportunity with Clara and Emma. He had likely orchestrated it, seeking out a vulnerable woman connected to a man he wanted to ruin. The day of the hearing arrived gray and overcast the sky, threatening a storm that mirrored the turmoil in Reed's soul. He and Emma rode to the courthouse in silence. She wore a simple, clean dress he had bought for her hair neatly braided. She looked older, her face set with a quiet determination that made his heart ache with a fierce protective pride. The courtroom was packed. Hank and Clara sat at the front, Hank looking confident and somber, Clara playing the part of the grieving guardian perfectly. Reed saw the whispers and the sideways glances from the townsfolk Hank had poisoned against him. The proceedings began, and it was just as Hank had planned. Clara's lawyer painted Reed as an unstable recluse, a violent man who had snatched a child out of misguided grief. He brought witnesses, men Hank had bought drinks for women he had charmed, who testified to Reed's short temper and unsettling solitude. When it was Reed's turn, he didn't refute their claims directly. He stood before the judge and spoke plainly. "I am a quiet man. I have lived with loss. That is true. But none of it changes what happened to this girl." He turned to Emma. "Tell him," he said, his voice gentle. "Tell him the truth." Emma walked to the front of the courtroom. Her voice was small but clear, and it carried to every corner of the silent room. She spoke of the cold, the hunger, the casual cruelty of Clara's cane. She didn't cry. She just stated the facts. Then she rolled up her sleeve and showed the judge the pale latticed scars on her forearm. A collective gasp went through the room. The judge, a man who had seen his share of liars, looked from the scars on Emma's arm to the venom in Clara's eyes, and his decision was swift. He dismissed the petition, ruling that Emma would remain in Reed's care. Clara let out a choked cry of outrage, but Hank placed a calming hand on her shoulder, his expression unreadable. As the courtroom emptied, Hank caught Reed's eye. He gave a small, slow smile, a look that said, "This is not over." This was just the opening move. Reed knew it too. He had won the battle, but the war was just beginning. And Hank Cooper was not a man who would accept defeat. The confirmation came 2 nights later. Reed was awakened by Bramble's frantic whinnying from the barn. He grabbed his rifle and was out the door in an instant. There was a flicker of orange against the far side of the barn, a small fire deliberately set in a pile of dry hay. It was small, meant not to destroy, but to warn, to terrify. He and Emma worked together, using horse blankets and buckets of water to beat back the flames. They extinguished it before it could take hold, but the acrid smell of smoke and malice hung in the air. As the adrenaline faded, Emma found it near the barn door. A noose fashioned from rough rope hanging from a nail. A clear and brutal message. Reed cut it down his face, a mask of cold fury. This was the escalation he had been waiting for. Hank was done with whispers and legal games. He sent Emma inside, telling her to bolt the door. He didn't go back in. Instead, he saddled Bramble, his rifle now loaded and resting across his lap. He had to end this. But as he prepared to ride out and hunt Cooper down, a new horrifying thought struck him. Why the barn? Why not the house? It was a distraction. He spun around, his heart seizing in his chest. "Emma," he roared, running toward the cabin. The front door was still bolted, but the window on the side, the one in Emma's small room, was shattered. Her cot was empty. Her book lay splayed on the floor. She was gone. On her pillow, nestled in the slight depression where her head had been, was a single white feather, tied at the quill with a strip of red cloth. It was a trail marker, a taunt, an invitation, and Reed knew exactly where he was being led. To the one place on earth he he had sworn he would never return. The dark, gaping mouth of the Silver Creek mine. The ride to the abandoned mine was a frantic, desperate prayer fueled by fury and fear. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a mocking whisper. Reed pushed Bramble harder than he ever had, before the horse's labored breaths matching the frantic rhythm of his own heart. The moon was a sliver in the sky, offering little light, but Reed knew the way by a dark, unshakable instinct. He was riding into the heart of his own nightmare. The mine entrance loomed out of the darkness, a jagged black wound in the side of the mountain. The support timbers were rotten, the tracks leading into the abyss rusted and broken. A sign barely legible warned danger, unsafe. It was a tomb, and Hank Cooper had chosen it as the stage for his final act. He dismounted, tethering Bramble to a skeletal pine tree. He could see the faint, flickering glow of a lantern from deep within the mine. Hank was waiting. Reed checked his rifle, took a deep breath of the cold, pine-scented air, and stepped out of the world of the living and into the realm of the dead. The air inside was immediately cold and damp, thick with the smell of wet earth and decay. Water dripped from the low ceiling, each drop echoing in the oppressive silence. He moved slowly, his boots crunching on loose gravel, the rifle held at the ready. The lantern light grew stronger as he ventured deeper, casting long, menacing shadows that danced like specters on the rock walls. He found them in the main chamber, the place where the tunnels branched off into the mountain's guts. Emma was tied to a large support beam, a gag in her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. Hank stood beside her, holding the lantern aloft. He wasn't smiling anymore. His face was a raw, twisted mask of grief and hatred. "Welcome home," Maddox Hank's voice echoed unnaturally in the enclosed space. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come." "Let her go." Hank Reed said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his soul. "This is between you and me. She has no part in it." "She has every part," Hank sneered, gesturing around the chamber. "This is where it ended for them. My sister, my brother, all because of you. I wanted you to feel it. To have something you care about ripped away from you in the dark. To know you are helpless to stop it." "The collapse was an accident," Reed said, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. "An accident." Hank laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "There are no accidents when greed is involved. Your family pushed the foreman to dig faster, to cut corners on safety, to chase the silver vein no matter the cost. You were right there with them." He took a step closer to Emma, placing the blade of a knife against the ropes that bound her. "An eye for an eye, Maddox. A family for a family." This was the moment Reed had been preparing for, the one he had seen in his nightmares. But something was wrong. The air felt heavy, not just with tension, but with the physical weight of the mountain. He heard a low groan from the timbers above, followed by a shower of dust and small pebbles. The mine was unstable. Hank's presence, the vibrations of their voices, it was all threatening to bring the rest of the tunnel down. "This whole place is coming down," Hank Reed said, trying to keep his voice calm. "We all need to get out of here. Now." "Not until you know the truth," Hank said, his eyes blazing with a feverish light. "Not just about the greed. About your part in it." "What are you talking about?" "You don't remember, do you?" Hank taunted. "You've buried it, haven't you?" The guilt was too much. That final blast, the one that brought it all down. The charges were set wrong. Too much powder. Thomas, my own brother, he saw it. He tried to warn you. But you were in a hurry. You gave the order anyway." The words hit Reed like a physical blow, unlocking a memory he had sealed away in the darkest corner of his mind. He remembered it now. The argument. Thomas yelling that the charges were too heavy, that the supports wouldn't hold. Reed pressured by the foreman, eager to finish the job, overriding him. "It'll hold," he had said. "Light the fuse." The secondary twist landed with sickening force. It wasn't just an accident he had survived. It was an accident he had caused. The guilt he had carried for 5 years was nothing compared to the crushing weight of this revelation. He was responsible. As the truth washed over him, the mountain groaned again, louder this time. A large timber directly above Hank and Emma cracked, splintering under the immense pressure. Rock and dirt rained down. You see Maddox Hank screamed over the noise, a wild look of triumph on his face. Now we all die together. This is justice. Reed didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle, but he didn't aim at Hank. He fired at the rock wall just behind him. The bullet ricocheted, striking the lantern Hank was holding. It shattered, plunging the chamber into near-total darkness, save for the faint moonlight filtering from the entrance far down the tunnel. In the confusion, Reed surged forward. He tackled Hank, driving him away from Emma just as the massive overhead beam gave way completely. It crashed down where they had been standing seconds before, kicking up a blinding cloud of dust and debris. Reed scrambled to his feet, coughing, his eyes stinging. He cut Emma's ropes with his knife, pulling the gag from her mouth. "Go!" he yelled, pushing her toward the entrance. "Run and don't look back." She stumbled but obeyed, disappearing into the darkness. Reed turned back, his pistol now in his hand, searching for Hank in the dust-choked chaos. He found him pinned, his leg trapped beneath a smaller fallen beam, the main timber having missed him by inches. "Help me!" Hank gasped, his face pale with pain and fear. The mine shuddered violently, and the sound of cracking rock echoed from deeper in the tunnels. The entire structure was failing. Reed had a choice. He could leave Hank to his fate, let the mountain that took his family become his tomb. It would be a fitting final justice. Or he could save the man who had tried to kill him and the man who had just destroyed the last of his peace. He looked at Hank's terrified face, and he didn't see a monster. He saw a man broken by grief, twisted into a vessel of hate. Leaving him here would be an execution, and Reed knew in that moment that he could not add another ghost to the chorus that already haunted him. He had to be the man Ilara believed he was. With a roar of exertion, he heaved at the beam, his muscles screaming in protest. It shifted just enough. Hank pulled his mangled leg free. Why? Hank choked out, staring at him in disbelief. "Because this isn't who I am," Reed said, grabbing him by the collar and dragging him toward the entrance. "And it's not who you are, either." They staggered out of the mine and into the clean, cold moonlight, just as a final thunderous roar erupted from behind them. The entrance of the Silver Creek mine collapsed in on itself, sealing the darkness forever in a cloud of red dust and finality. The aftermath was a blur of dust, moonlight, and ragged breaths. Emma ran to Reed, throwing her arms around him in a fierce, trembling hug. He held her tight, burying his face in her hair, overwhelmed by a relief so profound it felt like pain. Across the clearing, Hank lay on the ground, cradling his shattered leg, his face a mixture of agony and stunned confusion. The hate had been washed out of him, replaced by the raw animal reality of his own mortality. Sheriff Mallory and a small posse, alerted by the sounds of gunfire and the distant roar of the collapse, arrived an hour later. They found a scene of quiet resolution. Reed explained everything: Hank's identity, the revenge plot, the kidnapping. Hank surprisingly didn't deny it. He confessed, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, as if the mountain's collapse had crushed his vengeful spirit along with his leg. They took him away on a makeshift stretcher, his future now a matter for judges and prisons. Before they left, Mallory stopped in front of Reed. "You did the right thing, Maddox. Both in there," he said, nodding toward the sealed mine, "and out here." As the posse disappeared down the trail, Clara Stanton's fate was being decided by the swift and unforgiving justice of a small town. When the news of her complicity in the kidnapping and Cooper's violent revenge plot spread through Redemption, the thin veneer of sympathy she had cultivated shattered completely. The women of the church sewing circle who had listened to her tales of woe now slammed their doors in her face. The blacksmith refused to shoe her horse. The mercantile owner cut off her credit, ostracized and exposed with her protector gone and her cruelty laid bare. She packed her bags in the dead of night and vanished, becoming nothing more than a bitter memory, a cautionary tale whispered by the wind. The ride back to the ranch was long and silent. The sun was rising, painting the eastern sky in soft shades of pink and orange, a stark contrast to the darkness they had just escaped. When they arrived, the cabin stood just as they had left it, a simple, sturdy sanctuary against the chaos of the world. Emma went inside and immediately put a kettle on the stove, her small practical actions a way of reclaiming the space, of banishing the lingering shadows of the night. Reed stood on the porch, watching the light spread across his land. He felt hollowed out, scoured clean by the night's events. The guilt over his role in the accident was no longer a suppressed memory, but a known fact, a scar he would carry forever. But it was no longer a weapon that could be used against him. By confronting it, by choosing to save Hank, he had finally taken ownership of his past. He walked inside and sat heavily at the table. Emma placed a steaming mug of tea in front of him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. Finally, he looked at her, his eyes full of a sorrow and a gratitude that words couldn't contain. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice raw. And he did. He told her everything. About Ilara and Thomas, about his pride and his carelessness, about the crushing weight of the secret he had carried for 5 years. He didn't make excuses or ask for forgiveness. He just laid the truth on the table between them, a broken, painful thing. When he was finished, the silence returned heavier this time. Emma listened without interruption, her expression serious and thoughtful. She reached across the table and placed her small hand over his large, calloused one. "You're not that man anymore," she said softly. Her voice was not one of judgment or pity, but of simple, profound acceptance. "That man died in the mine too. The one who brought me home. That's who you are now." A single tear traced a path through the grime on Reed's cheek. He didn't wipe it away. It was a release, a cleansing. In the quiet warmth of the cabin, with this brave, resilient girl who had seen the worst of him and still chose to stand by him, Reed Maddox finally felt the first tentative stirrings of peace. The ghosts were still there, but for the first time they were silent. Months passed, and the seasons turned. The harsh wound of that night slowly began to scar over, healing into the quiet rhythm of life on the ranch. The autumn rains came, washing the last of the summer's dust from the air and turning the fields a deep, rich brown. Winter followed, blanketing the land in a pristine layer of snow, muffling the world in a peaceful silence. Through it all, the small cabin remained a pocket of warmth and steadfastness. The bond between Reed and Emma solidified, no longer defined by crisis and survival, but forged in the daily acts of shared living. They fell into an easy partnership. He taught her how to track game and mend a collapsed corral fence. She taught him how to laugh again, a sound that had been absent from the cabin for so long it felt like a miracle. Her presence filled the empty spaces in the house, and in his heart, her quiet strength a constant grounding force. The nightmares faded for both of them. The town of redemption, having seen the truth of things, embraced them. People who had once looked away now tipped their hats to Reed, and the women from the church often left pies and preserves on their porch. They were no longer the reclusive rancher and the orphan girl. They were Reed and Emma, a family forged not by blood, but by choice. One evening in early spring, as the last of the snow melted and the first green shoots pushed through the stubborn earth, Reed sat by the fire, a small object in his hands. It was the locket. The sheriff had returned it to him after Hank's trial, a piece of evidence no longer needed. He had spent the winter polishing the tarnished silver, carefully working out the dents, until the image of the lark shone once more. He called Emma over. She sat on the hearth beside him, watching the flames dance. "I want to tell you about her," he said, his voice quiet. About Ilara. He spoke for a long time, not of the tragedy, but of the life. He told Emma about Ilara's fierce laugh, her love for wildflowers, the way she could calm even the most stubborn horse. He spoke of their dreams of the family they had hoped to build on this very land. As he talked, he wasn't just sharing memories. He was letting Emma into the part of his past he had kept locked away, introducing her to the ghost who had shaped him. When he finished, he held out the locket. The silver gleamed in the firelight. "This belonged to the family I lost," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He opened her small, work-roughened hand and placed the locket in her palm, closing her fingers around it. "Now it belongs to the family I found." Emma looked down at the silver lark, its wings outstretched as if in perpetual flight. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not look away. She simply nodded, a universe of understanding passing between them in that one small gesture. She unclasped the chain and with trembling fingers fastened it around her neck. It settled against her skin, a cool weight of memory and promise. It was not a replacement, but a connection, a bridge between the love that was lost and the love that had against all odds been found. He placed a hand on her shoulder, and together they sat in the warm, comfortable silence, watching the fire. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of damp earth and new beginnings. The past was not gone, but it had found its proper place. The ghosts were at peace. The house was no longer a monument to what was lost, but a home filled with the steady, quiet hope of what was to come.